In the vast history of America, one narrative stands out but remains largely untold: the story of Black American Indians, the true original inhabitants of the land. This is a story of reclassification, loss, and erasure, a tale of a people who were stripped of their identity and land by the government. These so-called African Americans aren't African at all, and many across the globe know this truth, even as it's kept from the general public. Before European contact, millions of black people, who were later called American Indians, lived across what we now know as the United States. Their presence on the land was undeniable. They were not immigrants from Africa brought here by boat, but indigenous people who had been here for thousands of years. However, a calculated plan was set in motion by the US government, aiming to erase their claim to the land by changing their identity. Over time, laws were put in place that allowed black people to be brutalized, hung, raped, and killed with impunity. The legal system was never on their side, so why would the government ever help them reclaim their identity? The government actively worked to suppress the truth, instead pushing a narrative that they were Africans brought to America in chains. But let's examine that narrative closely. The popular story claims that millions of Africans were transported across the Atlantic Ocean in cramped, unsanitary conditions on sailboats. From 1492 to the 1800s, it's said that millions of people survived a 90-day voyage in ships packed so tightly that there was no room to breathe, let alone to maintain basic hygiene. It is impossible to fathom the survival rate in such horrific conditions, yet we are told millions made it. The reality is, transporting that many people under those conditions would have been a death sentence for the vast majority of them. It simply doesn't add up. So why tell this story? The goal was to sever the connection between black people and their land in America. If you believe you came from elsewhere, you won't fight for what's yours. By painting black Americans as foreigners, Africans brought by boat, the government rewrote history. The truth is, black people were already here. They owned land, millions of acres, and had thriving communities long before European settlers arrived. And yet, the history books conveniently skip over this fact. Instead, they tell a story designed to disconnect black people from their ancestral homeland. The real story isn't one of Africans arriving in chains, but of black people already here, deeply rooted in the soil of the Americas. The enslaved millions were the people already present on the land, not immigrants from across the sea. In addition, black people in America, like other indigenous groups, have always been organized in tribes, communities with their own systems, traditions, and ways of life. But these tribal communities were demonized by the government, which labeled them as gangs and painted them as dangerous and destructive. In reality, these were the natural social structures of a people that had been here for centuries. Moreover, the systemic oppression of black people didn't stop at cultural erasure. The government actively worked to undermine these communities, redlining neighborhoods and flooding them with drugs in a deliberate attempt to destabilize and destroy black lives. This wasn't just happenstance, it was part of a larger scheme to ensure black Americans never reclaimed their power or their identity as the original people of this land. The reason why black people have never received reparations is because the government insists on classifying them as African Americans, a term designed to keep them disconnected from their true heritage. Reparations for African Americans would imply compensation for slavery, but if black Americans were acknowledged as the original inhabitants of this land, the conversation would change drastically. They wouldn't just be owed reparations for slavery, but for centuries of land theft, genocide, and cultural erasure. The term Indian itself, which has come to be associated with Native American tribes, originally meant black. This wasn't a name black people gave themselves, it was a label assigned by European colonizers who were confronted with the sight of dark-skinned people inhabiting these lands. But over time, the government systematically erased the connection between black people and the land, replacing them in historical records with Asian and Mongolian migrants who came from Siberia. This paper, Genocide, as it is called, ensured that the original black inhabitants of America were written out of the history books. Yet this truth is not entirely hidden. The United Nations, other nations, and even the US government know the real history of black people in America. America itself is older than Africa, not in the geographical sense, but in the sense that the black civilizations here predate the arrival of the first European ships to these shores. This narrative is far from accepted mainstream history, but the time has come for it to be told. The story of Black American Indians isn't just a tale of injustice. It's a testament to the resilience and enduring spirit of the people who were here long before America was called America. And it's time for the world to remember that. The real history of Black American Indians has been buried for far too long, but it is still alive in the stories passed down from generation to generation. By reclaiming this narrative, we can begin to heal and restore the truth of who we are. The original inhabitants of America, long before colonization, slavery, or the rewriting of history ever began.